Hello and welcome. I am very excited, and so is my dog. I don't know if you heard that. But I'm here today with Ginger Vanhoozer, who is the first pole dance researcher we've had on the podcast. Some background for me, I think I mentioned a couple times, right? Like I have a background in sciences, I have a PhD, I've been a researcher. I'm also really interested in SciComm, science communication. And a goal for mine has always been to sort of like have a little bit of pole SciComm and, go straight to the source. So I'm very excited to have Ginger. And I will say, before we say anything else, Ginger is currently doing a study. There is a link below for participants. I know y'all are pole dancers. Go do the study first and then come back and listen, because we're going to talk about, what's going on there and some of the things that Ginger's looking for. And I don't want to bias the results. So go do it's super quick. I'll de-anonymize myself. I'm a participant. It took like 3 minutes, very fast. You can just do it on your phone and then come on back. Now that you're back, thank you for participating in science. Ginger, I would love to hear a little bit about, what it is that, as much as your research background as you're interested in sharing, a little bit about your disciplinary background, right? What field are you working in? And then what drew you to doing research on pole dance? I know that's like 5 questions, but pick the one you want to answer first.
Okay. I will say that I have an eclectic background. I did my undergrad in theater and directing, and then went straight into the Peace Corps, and then came back and joined the Army Reserves and trained as a nurse, and spent most of my career working in healthcare as a nurse, and then transitioned about 8 years ago into epidemiology. And so I worked in healthcare epidemiology for 6 or 7 years, and I have been very painfully, slowly, since way back in my Army days, working on my master's in public health. So I've weaved in and out of the public health world a lot through the work that I do, but mostly through the lens of epidemiology. And the main thing that's important about that is that epidemiology looks at like population level things, right? So I kind of look at that lens of not an individual, but what happens when we look at that all together. So when I thought about what I wanted to spend my future work on and my graduate thesis on, there were some easy things I could have done related to the work that I do, but what I'm passionate and wanted to spend more time on, bad rap in academic literature, is around pole dancing. And so I thought, what a great opportunity that I have an actual, review board. I can do an IRB approved, like official study with this lens and respectability and try to get it published, to be able to parse out some things that I think are really interesting about pole and to public health in general. CDC's got 2030 healthy people goals where it wants to like reduce stress and like people exercise more. But we don't often think about like, what do people really want to do? And I'm really interested in what like real people want to do, and maybe things we could make small tweaks on to make them feel better, to make their practice more beneficial to what they want to do. So I think that's what this study is really going to help do, is give a little bit more information, because there's only a handful of research studies done on pole dance, and none of them through a public health lens.
No. And there's been sort of an interesting discussion going on in, I guess, the sort of like pole circus adjacent training space about how, you can't prevent injury. And it's something that a lot of people have been talking about. I want to say circus mobility has mentioned it, for example. And the thinking there is like, you can never completely prevent everyone from getting injured, right? So from that lens, yeah, you can't prevent injury. But from, a more social public health benefit, right? You can say, okay, if we change this thing about how we teach pole, we could prevent 6 injuries a year in a population of 100 students, right? So you can prevent injury. And we don't necessarily know yet, what interventions are going to have what degree of effect on, what aspect of health. And obviously, maybe not obviously, I would say you're working more on the mental health side of things. Not that, stress has a lot of physiological effects as well, but you're not specifically looking at like traumatic injury as your object of study. So I think the public health lens is really beneficial, especially, for people like me in the pole industry who are like, okay, what can we do to support our students? What can we say about pole and have evidence to back that up? Evidence-based pole podcast. I care a lot about evidence, okay? And so do epidemiologists in my, I would say, robust experience. I sort of hung out with them in grad school. Yeah. So everyone, having already gone and done the study, you're not going to be ruined as participants. Tell us a little bit about what you are investigating and maybe some of the related literature that helped you be like, okay, there might be something here. There might be something going on.
So one thing that I wanted to look at, and sort of the core of this study, is a survey tool that's been validated and used in the past to look at how well you tolerate uncertainty. Is one particular lens of anxiety, right? Like there's lots of different causes and expressions of anxiety, but I thought that this one was a really close fit for POL because there's either you've got a death grip and you've got every step planned out, or you just succumb, right? So I best capture their expression of anxiety on principle. And there's a secondary piece to this study that's approved, which is to talk to studio owners about their pedagogy and how they teach and how that might impact it. Because some of the questions we ask surrounding the actual uncertainty scale is about how you practice, what intention you bring to it. But I think there's a piece that will be interesting to look at if we get enough respondents to see, okay, this is what people at the studio intended, and this is what they brought to it. But is there a trend in that from what is being taught and how that's being expressed by the students? The tool itself is it was often the other studies that it was done in were in younger populations. There were a couple in academic situations, and POL tends to have a younger group. And I think that the tool itself is easy to explain. It doesn't bring out feelings, I feel like, of anxiety with it, although I did give some support if folks were needing some mental health support after the study. But I think that those pieces really align with POL in particularly well. And then there are some tidbits in there about whether or not someone has access to a POL or are actively working as a POL worker and what that might look like in different responses. Because I definitely see for folks that I just know that start at a POL studio and then start working, how that sometimes impacts them. So I think that's one part that I snuck in that I would love to lay some groundwork for future research as well.
Definitely. And you mentioned a couple things in there that I'd love to sort of pick at those threads a little bit. So one term that you use that people may not be familiar with is survey instrument. So I think at one point in the distant past, xylophone, chime music, blah, 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 I thought writing surveys was easy and straightforward and that it was really hard to mess up. And as it turns out, that's really not the case. Surveys are extremely difficult to get interesting, valid results from. So do you want to talk a little bit about, how do you know that this survey is good, right? Is it just like one person does a survey and everyone's like, I'm too lazy to write my own survey, I'm going to use theirs? Or is there a deeper reason why you might reuse an instrument and some of the thought that goes into developing them?
The nice thing about using in this being a validated tool that had been used in the past, that initially that this uncertainty question had 24 questions to it, which is a lot, but they were able to look at how people responded to those. And then when this is the short form, that's only 12 questions, and they were able to compare the answers in the groups that they had to previous responses from the larger tool. And part of it is that questions need to make sure that we're not leading, that there's not bias in it, that we're not asking questions that are only culturally relevant to some people and might exclude others. So the nice thing about using a previously validated tool is that we're not putting any of that unintentional mix in there. And so that we can really sort of get to the question that we're asking. Will the responses to this tell me how people feel about their anxiety levels? Will that answer the question? So I think that's what really a good survey tool does, is that it answers the question that you ask and it doesn't have any inherent bias to it, intentionally or unintentionally, so that it's a good survey for the population you're trying to use. And that's why I particularly like this one, because it had been used a lot in 20 to 30 somethings, which a survey tool that wanted to capture anxiety in 80 something year olds might be a different fit because they have a different worldview and have different stresses. So finding the right tool that not only is created well, but is created in similar populations that you think it will work well in yours is an important part of it too.
Absolutely. So you know it's a good tool because it's been used before. And in particular, this larger survey and the smaller survey looking at the same people, okay, the results are consistent within it. So you don't have to ask everybody as many questions and you have evidence. You have evidence that it's going to work well. And the other thing you mentioned, and this is something that I've seen a little bit in some of the POL literature, is you want enough people, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about statistical power? I'm not going to do a whole big lead up. What's about statistical power? Why would the number of people matter? Can't we just ask 3 people?
So it's an interesting question about statistical power. So some of the last poll literature there's different kinds of surveys, right? So there's, these qualitative, I sat down and I interviewed these people at length and I talked to 30 people and that gave me lots of rich data. But when we're talking about a different survey, and a survey like this in particular, the more people that you can get to answer it, the idea of it's like the jelly bean jar, right? If 5 people guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, we're going to get answers all over the place. But if 500 people answer the jelly bean question, that the answer is going to be closer to the actual one, because the power, the number of people that you have responses from, the more you have, the more likely you are to be able to get to an answer of, is this significant? Is this reliable? Is this something that I can use to extrapolate out to other resources, other types of fields? Because I think a great question about this study is about the layering of embodiment work and things onto it. And I think there's lots of other places where that could apply. And especially not too far away from pole, I think is weightlifting is a great example of what's the intention and how it's taught and how you process it. Will that give you more benefit from an anxiety perspective than on top of all the great physical stuff you get from it? So by increasing that power, it gives us more of a statistical reliability of yes, we think we can use these answers because you had enough people to say so, is the gist of statistical power.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And, the subtler the effect, the more people you're going to need, right? So especially if you're looking for something that, may vary quite a lot, it may not be a huge difference between the different populations you're looking at, you're going to need a lot more people. And also, you asked fewer questions rather than more questions. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, the nice thing about using this particular tool that I used is that the previous work that had been done on it said asking these particular questions in this particular order gave the same benefit as asking more. So there's less variables that I have to compare between each other, which helps because I also wanted to know a lot of other information. So some of those questions about do you have a pole foam? Are you a pole worker? Things like that, I can do more comparison in between those because I have less questions I have to statistically compare between the actual tool that I'm using. So asking less questions in the tool allowed me to ask more questions sort of around it, because there is such a lack of research, hard research out there. And I'm biased when I talk about the qualitative research, there's great stuff on feminist literature and perspective. But what I want to know is something that is a little bit more nuts and bolts answers and can do that funky math that we all have flashbacks and sweat about to see, can I really make assumptions based on this? Can I say that there's likely a link between?
Yeah, definitely. One way that I like to think about this type of study is that it's helping us reduce our uncertainty. Sorry, I'm sure you can hear my dog is very upset because it's dinner time. Where is dinner? So if you're hearing little squeaks in the background, it's my dog. Is we're trying to reduce our uncertainty about the world, right? So right now, is there a relationship here? Yeah. If you ask me, I don't know, I've got some guesses. And I also love qualitative research. It's very hard. But, if I study 10 people really in depth, I may actually be introducing more uncertainty. I may be, pulling out more nuance, and hopefully building towards an understanding and a larger, narrative that helps us, guide our knowledge of a particular subject.
I also think there's maybe when I think about where I think the study would be a good fit to publish, I think putting that idea of qualitative work on it to look at it from a public health perspective, but it also raises that up to a level it doesn't often get to play in, because people are okay, we'll talk to people about their feelings about pole, and there's lots of value in those things, but the place it hasn't had a spot in the sandbox is in that that really quantitative space of let's get into that deep statistical work. There was an interesting study looking at the strenuous and calories burned in what type of class you're in. There's been that, but we haven't looked at it from that mental health benefit in this way.
And most of the survey work has been specifically around injuries, and I would say is of varying statistical quality. So if someone were interested in, keeping up with your research or, learning more about the space, what were some next steps that you'd recommend for them?
Well, if you listen to this and you haven't taken the survey, maybe not take it, but tell your friends about it now that you know what we're looking for. So getting that word out, we're till June 19th is the closing day for the survey. So trying to get as many people as we can from different spots and different styles of poll to participate. And then after that, I think hopefully, it can take a while to get things published and having to go through that. So hopefully in the next 6 months or so, we can have some more. And I'd love to tell you, hopefully when it's published, so that you can share that with your, as well as I'd plan to message it out through all the places and advertising that there's a survey so that people can hear like, oh, that's where that went.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I should just let folks know that unfortunately there's no guarantee that any piece of research is ever going to be published, even if it is of very high quality. And there's some randomness in the system. Let's put it that way.
On the plus side, it will at least get published through my university as my thesis, so it will exist in the world, but hopefully it will get a broader audience than that corner of the internet where those go.
Yes, and if nothing else, I will read it. So definitely folks will read it. And I'm sure, y'all are nerds. Listen to this. I know, I love you. I say that with love in my heart as also a nerd. I'm sure many of you will also seek it out and read it. I think we may have to call it here.
I don't know what.
Thank you so much for joining me, Ginger. I'm really looking forward to hearing your results. Thank you for joining me. I would love to have talked longer, but I think my timer is up. And thank you so much to everybody for listening.
All right, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for having me. Bye.